Of the 4,600 men sealed inside the town of Tarnopol in the spring of 1944, 55 reached German lines. 4,545 were listed as casualties. That is a loss rate of 99%, and it was recorded against the garrison ordered to hold a town with no fortifications, no natural defences, and no airstrip to fly supplies into. Tarnopol stands on the Seret River in western Ukraine. The modern city carries the name Tarnopol. In 1944, it was a transport hub rather than a strongpoint. Several railway lines ran through it, and the most important of them was the line from Lvov to Odessa, the last rail connection east of the Carpathians joining those two cities. That line is the reason the town appears in the German order of battle at all. It is also the reason 4,600 men were told to remain inside it after the front had moved past them. On the 8th of March, 1944, Adolf Hitler issued Fuhrer Order No. 11. The order created a new category of position on the Eastern Front called the Fester Platz, the fortified place. 29 of them were designated. 2 days later, on the 10th of March, Tarnopol was added to the list. The theory behind the order was arithmetic. A fortified place was to be established in a town or city controlling a railway junction, a highway, or a communications node. The garrison inside it would allow itself to be surrounded. Once surrounded, it would hold down the largest possible number of enemy forces, on the assumption that taking or containing the town would cost the attacker more troops than the defender had committed to it. For an army facing a manpower shortage across a front running more than 1,000 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea, that exchange rate was the entire argument. The German command could not match the Red Army soldier for soldier. Fuhrer Order No. 11 proposed to make the shortage irrelevant by trading small garrisons for large besieging forces. The order's own guidelines listed what each fortified place was supposed to have: prepared defensive positions, roads blocked, bridges wired for demolition, supplies stockpiled ahead of the encirclement, a commandant with the authority to organize a defense in depth. German staff officers who read the guidelines noted at the time that the requirements were impossible to follow in most cases, and Tarnopol is the clearest example of why. The town had been a rear area transit point. It had no belt of works, no prepared strongpoints, no anti-tank ditch, and no stockpile. The document that turned it into a fortress arrived when the Red Army was already at the approaches. The doctrine had precedent, which is part of why it survived. Vitebsk, Cherkasy, Kovel, and Kamenets. Podolsky had all been handled under some version of the same logic in the first months of 1944. In each case, German staff officers could point to Soviet formations tied up in the reduction of a pocket rather than driving west. And in each case, no disaster on the scale of Tarnopol followed. The difference at Tarnopol was not the doctrine. The difference was that Tarnopol had no fortifications to defend, no airfield to supply it, and a garrison assembled out of whatever units happened to be standing in the town when the order arrived. That garrison numbered roughly 4,600 men in 6 infantry battalions. Its core came from the 359th Infantry Division, including Grenadier Regiment 949. These were regular Heer troops, German Army infantry. Around that corps sat a Fusilier battalion, a regional defence battalion, a proving battalion, elements detached from the 8th Panzer Division, and supply, construction and administrative personnel who had been in Tarnopol for reasons that had nothing to do with defending it. Some accounts also place battalions of the 357th and 69th Infantry Divisions in the mix. It was not a division, it was a list. The heavy weapons inventory is worth stating in full, because it measures what the order was actually asking of these men. 15 anti-tank guns, 320mm and 4 88mm anti-aircraft guns, 3 105mm and 8 155mm artillery pieces, 9 assault guns and 6 self-propelled guns. Against that, the 1st Ukrainian Front would eventually commit 5 rifle divisions in concentric attack, supported by a full Guards artillery division and a Guards tank brigade. A number of those 15 anti-tank guns were 37mm pieces, and the German troops who crewed them had a name for the weapon. They called it the Heeresankopfgerät, the army door-knocking device. The nickname had been earned in France in 1940 against the Char B1 and the Matilda, and it had hardened into contempt on the Eastern Front after late 1941, when crews found that a string of hits on the T-34 would ricochet off the sloped plate without affecting the tank at all. The gun's remaining function, in the phrase the crews used, was to knock on the door and tell the tank somebody was home. Tarnopol was being held against a Guards tank brigade in 1944, with a proportion of its anti-tank defence made up of a weapon its own gunners had written off 3 years earlier. The offensive that produced the encirclement opened on the 4th of March 1944, and it is recorded as the Proskurov-Chernozhny operation, the largest and most important component of the wider Dnieper-Carpathian offensive. The First Ukrainian Front had just changed hands. Nikolai Vachutin had been shot through the thigh at the end of February, ambushed by Ukrainian insurgent army fighters near the village of Milyatin, far behind his own front. The wound turned septic, and he would die of it in a Kiev hospital on the 15th of April, the same day the commandant of Tarnopol fell. Georgy Zhukov took over the front in his place. Zhukov opened with an artillery preparation and pushed Chernyakovsky's 60th Army and Grechko's 1st Guards Army into the German line, with Badenov's 4th Tank Army and Rybolko's 3rd Guards. Tank Army following in the second echelon. Within 2 days, the German front had a gap in it, about 110 miles wide and 15 to 30 miles deep. The 60th Army's assignment named Tarnopol directly, along with the line between Ozerna and Zolotniki beyond it. Soviet troops reached the Tarnopol line between the 7th and the 10th of March. Fighting was inside the town within days of that. The exact moment the ring closed behind the garrison is disputed, and the disagreement is not small. Some accounts place the isolation of the town in the second week of March, when Soviet close air support had already cut the road-bound German units and partly severed the town from the rear. Other accounts place the completed encirclement in the last week of the month, when the First Ukrainian Front finished the ring and the general assault opened. What is not disputed is the outcome. By the second half of March, the garrison was cut off from the German line, and the Lvov to Odessa railway that justified holding the town was useless to the army holding it. Zhukov's method explains part of that ambiguity. The Soviet approach was not to storm Tarnopol on arrival. It was to bypass the town, cut the supply lines running into it, open gaps between the German armies on either side, and leave the garrison isolated while the offensive continued west. The reduction of the pocket could then happen on a Soviet timetable rather than a German one. That sequencing is the detail that undoes the arithmetic of Fuhrer Order No. 11. A fortified place only ties down the enemy if the enemy agrees to be tied down. 3 men commanded Tarnopol in the space of a few weeks, and all 3 reached the same conclusion about it. General Hans Schrepfer asked permission to evacuate the town and was dismissed for it. General Heinrich Kittel asked the same and was dismissed as well. The third was General Major Egon von Neindorf, born in Koblenz in 1892, an officer who had previously commanded the 36th Infantry Division. He arrived on the 21st of January 1944 to take over as commandant. He made the same request and received the same answer. The reply that came back down the chain did not address tactics. The Führer's decision was that Tarnopol would be held. Von Neindorf's authority as commandant of a fortified place was narrower than his rank suggested. The designation removed his freedom of movement. He could fight in Tarnopol, and he could fight for Tarnopol, and those were the only 2 options the order left open. A commandant of a Fester Platz could not withdraw. He could not shorten his line by giving up ground he could not hold. He could not break out without permission from the top of the chain of command, and permission had already been refused to 2 of his predecessors in writing. That mechanism is what the doctrine relied on, and it is the mechanism that produced the casualty figure. Supply came from the air, or it did not come at all. Tarnopol had no airstrip, so nothing could land and nothing could take off, which also meant no evacuation of the wounded. Everything had to be dropped. Von Neindorf signalled the ammunition situation to higher headquarters, and the Luftwaffe responded with a drop of 44 containers over the town. Soviet anti-aircraft units around Tarnopol were heavy enough that the transport crews released their loads from about 2,000 feet or higher rather than descend into the guns. Roughly a third of that ammunition was recovered by the garrison. The rest came down in Soviet-held streets, in the river, or outside the perimeter entirely. A garrison being asked to tie down 5 divisions was resupplied at a rate of about 1 round in 3, delivered by parachute into a shrinking perimeter its own troops did not fully control. The attrition inside the pocket is documented against dates. Between the closing of the ring in the second half of March and the 8th of April, the garrison recorded 1,487 casualties, among those confirmed lost or severely wounded. By the 1st of April, more than half of the 4,600 men who had started were out of the fight. That figure is worth holding on to. Before the relief drive that the garrison had been promised even began, the fortified place had already lost more than half its strength. The Soviet reduction did not require a general assault. 5 rifle divisions attacked concentrically from 4 sectors. The 302nd came in from the west, the 322nd from the north, the 336th from the east, and the 117th Guards from the south. Behind them, Soviet artillery was moved onto the high ground around Tarnopol and fired over open sights into the buildings. Direct fire from high ground is the detail that decided how the town was reduced. Soviet gunners were not shelling Tarnopol off a map at range. They could see the individual buildings they were firing at, and they put rounds into individual structures until the structures came down onto the positions inside them. A garrison holding 3 105mm pieces and 8 155mm pieces had no counter-battery answer to a Guards artillery division working at close range with observed fire. The 15 anti-tank guns had no answer to armour that could stand off and let the artillery finish first. Every building the garrison held was a position until it was rubble, and then it was neither. That is the mechanism that turns a fortified place into an arithmetic problem with one solution. A garrison in open country can trade ground for time and fall back through successive positions. A garrison in a town it has been forbidden to leave cannot trade anything, because the ground it is standing on is the entire assignment. Each structure the Soviet artillery brought down removed a position from a perimeter that could not be extended, resupplied on the ground, or abandoned. The perimeter did not break. It shrank at the pace the guns worked, and every yard it shrank was a yard that could not be retaken by 4,600 infantrymen with 9 assault guns. Tarnopol also had no answer to the specific problem of the wounded. With no airstrip, nothing flew out. A soldier hit inside the pocket in the second half of March was still inside the pocket in April, being treated in cellars via medical service that could not evacuate a single casualty, and drawing on stocks that were being replaced by parachute at a rate of about 1 container in 3. The 1,487 casualties recorded to the 8th of April were not casualties who left. They stayed in the town and consumed what the town had. The first attempt to reach the garrison came on the 25th of March. Kampfgruppe Fliebe was a battle group built around the 8th Panzer Division, with 24 Panthers, 9 Tiger tanks and motorized infantry. It ran into successive Soviet anti-tank lines short of the town, and it was called off before it delivered anything at all. Fliebe withdrew without reaching Tarnopol and without getting a single container of supplies into it. The second attempt was the one the garrison was told to expect. It began on the 8th of April 1944, and it was a far heavier commitment. The relief force drew on the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, Heavy Anti-Tank Battalion 653rd with its Ferdinand tank destroyers, Heavy Tank Battalion 507th with Tigers, the 100th Geiger Division, the 349th and 367th Infantry Divisions, and what was left of Fliebe's armour from the 8th Panzer Division. Junkers Ju-87, Stukas carrying 37mm cannon flew in support. On paper, this was a force capable of breaking a corps. The distance was about 12 miles. That is how far behind the Soviet line Tarnopol sat when the relief drive opened, and 12 miles is not a long way for two panzer divisions in good conditions. Conditions were not good. The drive went in during the Rasputitsa, the spring thaw the Russians name roadlessness, when the black earth of Ukraine turns into a surface that will not carry tracked vehicles reliably and will not carry wheeled vehicles at all. The mud did to the relief force what Soviet anti-tank guns had not managed at that stage. Ferdinand tank destroyers, built heavy and underpowered for their weight, could not match the mobility of Soviet T-34s on thawing roads, and forcing them through the mire put great strain on their engines and overheated them. Heavy anti-tank battalion 653rd finished the campaign with 18 of its 31 Ferdinands still running. The rest were down for mechanical reasons rather than combat ones. The most heavily armoured vehicles in the relief force spent the operation being recovered rather than fighting. The relief drive covered roughly 6 miles. The assault on the village of Veliki Kodachkiv went in on the 15th of April, and that was the closest approach the operation achieved. 6 of the 12 miles were taken. The other 6 were held by Soviet anti-tank defences. The German armour could not clear at the pace the ground allowed, and the garrison inside Tarnopol had no strength left to come the other way and meet it. The relief drive was officially called off on the 18th of April, with Tarnopol still about 12 miles behind Soviet lines, exactly where it had been when the drive started. The relief force took at least 1,200 to 1,300 casualties, and the 9th SS Hohenstaufen carried the heaviest share of them. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen was not destroyed at Tarnopol. That point has to be made precisely, because the division's record in the same weeks is the measure of what Fuhrer Order No. 11 actually did. In those same weeks, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was running a second and much larger rescue operation, and the point where it succeeded lies about 25 miles southwest of Tarnopol. Hans Valentin Hube's 1st Panzer Army, somewhere between 200,000 and 220,000 men in 18 to 20 divisions, had been encircled in the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket by the same Soviet offensive that had cut off Tarnopol. Erich von Manstein argued the case for a breakout directly and repeatedly, and around the 24th of March, Hitler gave Hube permission to move. That permission is the entire difference between the two cases. Hube did not sit in the pocket. He drove it west, against the Soviet expectation that he would go south, across the Zeebrugge and the Seret and roughly 100 miles of enemy-held ground, fighting as a formation that moved. The pocket moved with him, and German officers afterward called it the Wandering Pocket. Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg drove east to meet him, and the link-up came near the town of Bukach in the first 10 days of April. Sources put the meeting between the 6th and the 9th of April, and the exact day is not settled. What is settled is that the majority of Hube's men came out. Almost all the heavy equipment was left behind, and only about 45 armoured vehicles escaped, but an entire Panzer Army rejoined the German line. The two operations ran days apart, in the same sector, under the same army group, with the same SS Panzer Corps supplying the muscle. One encircled formation of more than 200,000 men was permitted to move, and the bulk of it survived. One encircled garrison of 4,600 was designated a Fester Platz, refused permission 3 times, and lost 99% of its strength. The relief force was not the variable. The mud was the same mud, the thaw was the same thaw, and the Soviet armies in front of both were from the same front. The variable was the order. Hohenstaufen went on from there. In late April, the division was pulled out to refit, and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was assigned as reserve to Army Group North Ukraine. After the Allied landings in Normandy on the 6th of June, the Corps was ordered west on the 12th of June. Hohenstaufen reached the Caen sector on the 26th of June, delayed by losses to Allied fighter bombers on the road. It fought at Caen and on Hill 112, at Arnhem, in the Ardennes, and in the Spring Awakening offensive in Hungary. It surrendered intact to the United States Army at Steyr in Austria on the 8th of May 1945. Hohenstaufen was a mobile formation. It could be stopped by mud, pulled out of the line, rebuilt, and moved 1,000 miles to a different front, because nothing in its orders required it to stand still and be surrounded. The garrison of Tarnopol was not a mobile formation, and after the 10th of March it was not permitted to become one. It had been converted by a document into terrain. On the 15th of April 1944, on the same day the relief force was making its closest approach at Veliki Kodachkiv, General Major Egon von Neindorf fell to enemy fire during the final Soviet assault on the town. He was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves for the defence of Tarnopol. Command of what remained passed to Colonel Karl August von Schönfeld. The breakout went in that night. Roughly 1,500 men were still on their feet inside the pocket, out of the 4,600 who had been sealed into it. Sources differ on how many of those 1,500 were fit to fight, with some accounts putting the combat-ready figure closer to 700. The distinction mattered a great deal, because the plan required men to move on foot, at night, across open ground, through a Soviet line that had been prepared for exactly this attempt. At 2 in the morning on the 16th of April, von Schönfeld divided the column into two groups. One moved southwest toward the village of Jankova, the other headed west. Neither had armour, neither had artillery support. Neither had any prospect of a link-up, because the relief force was still 6 miles short and would be called off 2 days later. They were infantry walking out of a reduced town, and the ground between them and the German line was held by the 1st Guards Artillery Division, the 68th Guards Rifle Division, the 52nd Guards Tank Brigade, and the 135th and 148th Rifle Divisions. Von Schönfeld's group walked into the prepared positions of the 1st Guards Artillery Division. The officers leading it were lost, von Schönfeld among them, and with the command element gone, the column came apart into leaderless groups moving in the dark with no direction and no orders. It ceased to exist as a formation in the fields west of Tarnopol. Soviet forces reported the pocket eliminated on the 16th of April. 55 men reached German lines. The breakdown is recorded. 45 came out of von Schönfeld's group, and 10 came out of the other. Against a garrison of 4,600, that is 55 men returned and 4,045 casualties. 99%. The doctrine had promised an exchange rate, so the exchange is worth measuring. Tarnopol tied down 5 Soviet rifle divisions, a Guards artillery division, and supporting armour for about 4 weeks. In those same 4 weeks, the Proskorov-Chernovtsi operation ran from the 4th of March to the 17th of April, routed 22 German divisions, inflicted a heavy defeat on both the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies, and carried the Red Army between 50 and 220 miles west and south to the foothills of the Carpathians. The offensive that Tarnopol had been designated to blunt reached its objectives on schedule. The garrison did not delay it. It was bypassed in March and reduced at Soviet convenience in April while the operation ran on around it. The relief effort added to the bill rather than reducing it. At least 1,200 to 1,300 casualties were taken, trying to cover 12 miles that were never covered. Those casualties came out of divisions that Army Group North Ukraine needed as a mobile reserve, and they were taken for 6 miles of ground that was given up when the drive was called off on the 18th of April. 2 SS Panzer divisions, 2 heavy armoured battalions, 2 infantry divisions and a Jaeger division spent 10 days on an operation that produced no garrison, no railway and no town. Tarnopol itself ended in a condition that made the railway argument academic. The Lvov to Odessa line, the last rail link east of the Carpathians between those two cities, was in Soviet hands by the middle of April, along with the junction the entire defence had been justified by. The town had been taken apart building by observed artillery fire at close range. What the German command retained from 4,600 men, 6 infantry battalions, 2 relief operations and roughly 5 weeks of fighting was 55 men on foot. The doctrine did not change afterward. 29 fortified places had been designated in March, and more were designated through 1944 and into 1945, and the pattern held with them. A town was declared a fortress after it was already threatened rather than before. A garrison that had not been assembled or equipped for the task was told to hold it and refused permission to leave. A relief force was committed late, stopped short, and took casualties it could not replace. The garrison was then reduced, and the units that made it up were struck from the order of battle. The one case in the same weeks that broke the pattern is the one that proves what the pattern was. Hube's 1st Panzer Army was not saved by better troops, better armour or better weather. Every one of those was worse in the Kamenets. Podolsky Pocket, which was larger, deeper behind the Soviet line and holding a longer stretch of the same thaw. It was saved because Manstein spent his own position arguing for one thing, and got it: permission to move. Hube then used it, and roughly 200,000 men came west out of an encirclement to a link-up at Bukash, while 4,600 men, about 25 miles to the northeast, were being told to stand still in a town with no fortifications. Nobody of Manstein's rank made that argument for Tarnopol. The requests to release the Tarnopol garrison came from inside the town, from the 3 officers commanding it, and they went up the chain from men who could be dismissed for sending them. Schrepfer sent one and was dismissed. Kittel sent one and was dismissed. Von Neindorf sent one and was refused. The garrison was left with the 2 options Fuhrer Order No. 11 permitted: fight in Tarnopol or fight for Tarnopol. What that argument cost the man who did make it for a different formation is on the record as well. Manstein pressed the case for Hube's army to the point of an ultimatum on the 24th of March, informing Hitler that he would order the 1st Panzer Army to move unless he was told otherwise by a fixed hour that afternoon. He got his permission. On the 30th of March 1944, 6 days after the ultimatum and roughly a week before Hohenstaufen reached Buchach, Erich von Manstein was relieved of command of Army Group South. 200,000 men came out of the Kamenets Podolsky Pocket, and the field marshal who had insisted on it did not hold the command again. Von Neindorf received the oak leaves posthumously for a defence he had asked to be released from. Hans Schrepfer and Heinrich Kittel had reached the same conclusion about Tarnopol before him, and had been removed from command for reaching it. All 3 professional judgments were overruled from the same desk by the same order on the same reasoning. Karl August von Schönfeld, who inherited the command with 1 night left to run, was lost in the fields west of the town with the men he was leading out of it. Of the 4,600 men Fuhrer Order No. 11 put inside Tarnopol, 55 came back. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen, the division sent to reach them and stopped 6 miles short, fought on for another 13 months across 2 more fronts, and surrendered its remaining strength to the American army in Austria in 1945. The difference between those 2 outcomes was not courage, equipment, or the quality of the troops involved. It was that one formation was permitted to move, and the other had been ordered to stand still.